female, and therefore your order is unlawful.
Unlawful? You think quoting some fancy words is going to help you? This is the street, lady, not a courtroom. My word is the law out here. Get out of the car, now!
The morning sun cast long, sharp shadows across the quiet suburban streets, but inside Officer Derek Miller's patrol car, the atmosphere was cold and charged. At 36, Miller carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who believed his badge was a crown and his authority absolute. He had the sharp jawline and close-cropped hair of a recruiting poster, but his eyes, a flat, unforgiving blue, held a permanent glint of impatience. Today, that impatience was boiling over into a low-grade rage. The last call had been a bust, a fruitless domestic dispute where both parties had turned on him, their shared disdain for law enforcement a brief, infuriating point of unity. It had left a bitter taste in his mouth, a feeling of being disrespected and ineffectual. Now he was cruising, not with the intention of protecting and serving, but of reasserting the order he felt had been challenged. He was a predator looking for prey, for a situation he could control, for someone who would bend to the unassailable power he represented. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. The city's budget cuts had stalled his promotion, leaving him stuck on patrol while younger, more politically correct officers moved up the ladder. He saw the world through a lens of grievance, a place where the old rules of respect and fear were eroding, replaced by a culture of defiance he couldn't stomach. Every driver who failed to signal, every pedestrian who jaywalked was a personal affront. But he wasn't looking for minor infractions. He was looking for something that felt fundamentally wrong to him, something that didn't fit his rigid, preconceived picture of the world. It was a hunt fueled by a cocktail of personal frustration and professional arrogance, a dangerous combination in a man armed with a gun and qualified immunity. He passed a park where families were enjoying the mild weather, their laughter a distant, irritating sound. He ignored a car that drifted slightly over the center line, a soccer mom in a minivan too mundane to be a target. He was scanning, his gaze sweeping over vehicles and their occupants, his internal algorithm processing race, age, attire, and the perceived value of their car. This wasn't policing. It was profiling elevated to an art form, a subconscious checklist he would vehemently deny existed if ever questioned. But it was there, humming beneath the surface of his official duties, guiding his every decision. He saw a group of teenagers on a corner and his lip curled. But they were on foot, not a worthy enough challenge to restore his sense of dominance. He needed a confrontation with stakes, one where his authority would be undeniable. The city around him was waking up, a gentle hum of commerce and commute. Storefronts were opening, delivery trucks were making their rounds, and the day held the promise of unremarkable normalcy for everyone except the person who would next cross Officer Miller's path. He didn't know who it would be, but he knew what they would represent: a disruption to his worldview. Someone out of place. Someone whose very presence was a question he felt entitled to answer with force. The crackle of the radio was a steady companion, a stream of codes and locations that he barely registered. His focus was entirely external, a hunter's focus, sharp and narrow. The quiet street, the dappled sunlight, the peaceful rhythm of the neighborhood, all of it was just a backdrop for the drama he was preparing to create. He was a storm cloud gathering on a clear day, and somewhere ahead, an unsuspecting citizen was about to walk directly into his path. The coiled tension in his shoulders was a promise of conflict, a guarantee that before his shift ended, someone would be reminded of exactly who was in charge. And in his mind, that was the only justice that mattered. As Miller turned onto a wider, tree-lined avenue, his eyes locked onto it. A late-model charcoal gray sedan. It wasn't flashy or exotic, but it was sleek, expensive, and impeccably clean. It moved with a quiet confidence that seemed to annoy him instantly. Cars like that, in his experience, were either driven by established lawyers from the downtown firms or criminals who had no business affording them. He accelerated, his cruiser closing the distance not with the urgency of a pursuit, but with the deliberate pace of an approaching shark. He pulled up alongside the sedan, his gaze cutting through the passenger side window to the driver. He saw what he expected, and yet it still managed to ignite a fresh spark of indignation. A black woman. She appeared to be in her mid-30s, her hair styled professionally, her posture upright and focused on the road. She was wearing a tailored blazer over a simple blouse, the image of composed competence. And in Derek Miller's world, that was the problem. The combination was dissonant, an equation that didn't add up in his biased arithmetic. The woman, the car, the neighborhood. It was a trifecta of suspicion for him. He didn't see a professional on her way to work, he saw an anomaly. He saw someone who, in his twisted view, didn't belong in that vehicle. The seed of a narrative began to sprout in his mind. Stolen car, maybe. Drug money, perhaps. The possibilities were endless because they weren't based on evidence, but on a deep, ugly prejudice that he mistook for instinct. He dropped back, positioning his cruiser directly behind her. His hand hovered over the controls for the lights and siren. He didn't need a reason. He would create one. The driver of the sedan, Imani Knight, was completely unaware of the scrutiny she was under. Her mind was on the day ahead, a series of classified briefings at the federal building. She was a senior special agent with a federal agency, a job that demanded meticulous attention to detail, unwavering calm under pressure, and the ability to read situations with lightning speed. Her thoughts were a quiet checklist of objectives and potential threats related to her national security casework. The police cruiser in her rearview mirror was a non-event, a standard feature of the urban landscape. She had done nothing wrong. She was driving at the speed limit. Her signaling was precise, her movements fluid and lawful. She had no reason to believe she was being targeted. Miller followed her for 3 blocks, his eyes narrowed, searching for any mistake. A slightly wide turn? A moment's hesitation at a stop sign? He found nothing. Her driving was flawless, almost unnervingly so. This lack of error only served to heighten his suspicion. It felt practiced, too perfect, as if she were actively trying to avoid drawing attention. He decided he didn't need an actual violation. He just needed the pretense of one. As she approached an intersection preparing for a left turn, he saw his opening. It wasn't a real one, but it was enough for him. He memorized the intersection, the lane markings, and the flow of traffic. He would build his lie on this simple, everyday moment. The light turned green. She made her turn smoothly and correctly, and that's when he hit the lights. The sudden explosion of red and blue strobing in her rearview mirror was jarring. For a moment, Imani felt a flicker of confusion. She quickly ran through a mental diagnostic of her driving. Had she missed a sign? Was a taillight out? She knew her vehicle was in perfect condition. Finding no logical reason for the stop, a different, more familiar sense of caution began to creep in. She signaled, pulled over to the curb in a safe, deliberate manner, and put the car in park. She watched in her mirror as the officer's door opened, her training kicking in. She kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, waiting. She had no idea that the man walking toward her car had already tried and convicted her in his mind. Officer Miller stepped out of his cruiser with a practiced, intimidating swagger. He didn't rush. He took his time, his hand resting casually on his service weapon, a gesture designed to broadcast authority and threat. The sunlight glinted off his badge as he approached the driver's side window, his shadow falling over Imani. He ignored the peaceful surroundings, the gentle rustle of leaves, the distant sound of a lawnmower, the woman pushing a stroller on the opposite sidewalk. His entire world had narrowed to the space occupied by this car and the woman inside it. He didn't see a citizen to be served. He saw a suspect to be subdued. Imani rolled down her window, her face a mask of neutral professionalism. Her training had prepared her for countless high-stakes confrontations, and while this was, on the surface, a simple traffic stop, her instincts told her something was off. The officer's body language was too aggressive, his approach too deliberate. "Good morning, officer," she said, her voice even and calm. "Is there a problem?" Miller leaned down, his face uncomfortably close to the open window. He didn't return the greeting. He didn't offer his name or badge number. He skipped all pretenses of procedure and went straight to the accusation he had fabricated moments earlier. "You know you just made an improper lane change back there?" His tone wasn't inquisitive. It was accusatory, a statement of fact delivered with a condescending edge. Imani's mind instantly replayed the last few minutes of her drive. The left turn at the intersection, the lane markings. She knew with absolute certainty that she had not committed any violation. "I'm sorry, officer, but I don't believe I did," she replied respectfully but firmly. "I was in the designated left turn lane for that entire block." This calm, factual rebuttal was not the response Miller was expecting. He wanted fear, deference, maybe a flustered apology. He didn't get it. What he got was composure, and it infuriated him. "Don't tell me what you did or didn't do," he snapped, his voice rising in volume. "I saw you cut across the solid white line right at the intersection. Now let me see your license and registration." Imani maintained her eye contact, her expression unchanging. "I can assure you I did not cross any solid white line," she repeated, her tone still measured. "But I will, of course, provide you with my documents. They're in my purse on the passenger seat. I'm going to reach for them now, slowly." She narrated her movements, a standard practice to ensure an officer doesn't misinterpret an action as a threat. Her hand moved deliberately toward her purse. This was a test, she realized. The invented violation was just the pretext, the key to unlock the door. The real objective of this stop was something else entirely. Miller watched her with undisguised suspicion, his eyes scanning the interior of her car as if he expected to find contraband in plain sight. He saw a clean, organized space, a leather briefcase on the floor, a bottle of water in the console, no clutter, no mess. The sheer normalcy of it seemed to feed his anger. It didn't align with the narrative he was constructing. "Hurry it up," he grumbled, his impatience a palpable force. Imani retrieved her wallet and the vehicle's registration from the glove box. She held the documents out to him through the window. "Here you are, officer." Her movements remained smooth and economical. She was a coiled spring of readiness, her entire being focused and aware. But on the surface, she projected nothing but calm compliance. She knew the law. She knew her rights. And she knew, with a sinking feeling of certainty, that this officer had no interest in either. He was on a fishing expedition, and he had chosen her as his catch of the day. The question was no longer about a traffic ticket. It was about how far he was willing to push this illegal stop. Imani held her license and registration out the window, the plastic cards perfectly still in her steady hand. But Officer Miller didn't take them. He didn't even glance down. His eyes remained fixed on her face, then swept over the car's interior again, a look of dismissive judgment etched into his features. This single, deliberate act of refusal was more telling than any word he could have spoken. It was a power play. By ignoring the documents she offered, he was communicating that her identity, her legal status as the vehicle's owner, was irrelevant to him. The facts didn't matter. His suspicion did. "I asked for your license and registration, officer," Imani stated, not as a question, but as a reminder of his own demand. Her voice was still calm, but a new steely undercurrent was present. She was no longer just a citizen complying. She was an expert in procedure witnessing a flagrant violation of it. "I heard you," Miller sneered, finally taking his eyes off the car and locking them onto hers. "Before we get to that, why don't you tell me what you're doing in this neighborhood? You look a little lost." There it was, the pivot from a fabricated traffic violation to an overt act of profiling. The flimsy pretext had been abandoned, and the true nature of the stop was laid bare. Investigators would later point to this moment in the footage as the point of no return, where Miller consciously chose to escalate based on bias rather than law. Imani slowly retracted her hand, placing her credentials on her lap. "I'm not lost, officer, and my presence in this or any other neighborhood isn't a matter for official inquiry," she said, her words precise and devoid of emotion. "We can either address the supposed traffic violation you stopped me for, or if there is no violation, then I believe I am free to go." The legal accuracy of her statement was like gasoline on a fire. Miller's face flushed with anger. He wasn't accustomed to being lectured on the law, especially not by the person he had chosen to intimidate. His arrogance wouldn't allow him to process her words as a statement of rights. He heard them as a direct challenge to his authority. "You're free to go when I say you're free to go," he growled, leaning in closer. His voice dropped to a low, menacing tone. "Now I'm going to ask you one more time. Whose car is this?" "The car is registered to me, as you would see if you would simply look at the documents I've offered you," Imani replied, her patience, though monumental, beginning to wear thin. She refused to play his game. She would not justify her existence or her property to him. "Right," Miller scoffed, a disbelieving laugh escaping his lips. "A car like this, let me guess, your boyfriend bought it for you?" The insult was deliberate, a crude attempt to diminish her, to put her back in a box he could understand. Imani's jaw tightened, but her voice remained unshaken. "Officer, your line of questioning is inappropriate and unprofessional. Your refusal to accept my identification is a violation of standard procedure. I am asking you now, am I being detained or am I free to go?" She was building a verbal record, every word chosen to be clear and unambiguous for any potential recording or future testimony. She knew that in situations like this, the one who remains calm and professional often holds the ultimate power. Her composure was a mirror, reflecting his own unprofessionalism back at him, and he couldn't stand it. He straightened up, his hand dropping from his hip and gesturing vaguely at her car. "You're being detained," he declared, his voice booming with false confidence. "You're being detained for suspicious behavior." With that, he turned away from her window and walked back toward his cruiser, not to run her plates or check her ID, but to escalate the situation he had single-handedly created. Imani watched him go, a cold resolve settling over her. He had crossed a line, and now she knew this wouldn't end with a simple warning or even a ticket. It would end in a way Officer Miller could not possibly foresee. Officer Miller's voice, amplified by his fury, carried easily in the quiet morning air. His declaration, "You're being detained for suspicious behavior," was not just for Imani. It was a broadcast to the entire street, and the street was beginning to take notice. A man walking his dog paused on the sidewalk, his brow furrowed with concern. The woman with the stroller, who had been across the street, stopped and turned, her hand shielding her eyes from the sun as she watched the scene unfold. From a nearby coffee shop, a few patrons drifted toward the window, their morning routines interrupted by the raw drama of a roadside confrontation. Imani was acutely aware of the growing audience. In her line of work, witnesses could be both a liability and an asset. Today, she felt a sliver of relief at their presence. They were silent observers, their eyes and, in some cases, their cell phones becoming passive recording devices. Their presence created a bubble of accountability around the encounter, a silent jury to Miller's actions. She saw one man discreetly angle his phone, the small black lens aimed directly at her car. It was a small comfort, but a comfort nonetheless. Miller, however, seemed oblivious, or worse, indifferent to the attention he was attracting. When he saw the man with the dog staring, he shot him a glare that could have melted steel. "Move along!" he barked. "Police business!" The man flinched, but only took a few steps back, refusing to completely abandon the scene. Miller's arrogance was so profound that he saw the onlookers not as a check on his power, but as an audience for his performance of it. He believed their presence reinforced his authority, showcasing his control over the situation. He was wrong. Every witness who stopped, every phone that recorded, was another nail in the coffin he was building for his own career. He paced back and forth beside his cruiser for a moment, the picture of manufactured deliberation. He was thinking not about de-escalation or proper procedure, but about his next move. He had no legal grounds for this detention. He had no evidence of a crime. All he had was his own prejudice and a growing sense of being cornered by the calm, intelligent woman in the car. He had expected her to break, to become emotional, to give him an excuse to escalate further. Her unyielding composure was dismantling his script. He felt the need to re-establish dominance, not just for her, but for the growing gallery of silent accusers on the sidewalk. Inside her car, Imani remained perfectly still. She didn't look at the witnesses. She kept her gaze forward, her hands resting on the steering wheel. She was a statue of patience, letting Miller's aggression swirl around her like a storm she was determined to weather. She could hear the murmurs from the sidewalk, snippets of conversation. What did she do? He seems really angry. She hasn't done anything. The court of public opinion was already convening, and its verdict was not in Miller's favor. This public scrutiny should have been a warning sign for Miller, a signal to pull back and reassess. But his ego was too deeply invested. To him, backing down now in front of an audience would be the ultimate humiliation. It was a trap of his own making. He had escalated a baseless stop into a public spectacle, and now he felt he had to see it through, regardless of the consequences. The presence of witnesses didn't temper his behavior, it fortified his resolve to be proven right, even if it meant manufacturing the evidence to do so. He turned his back on the onlookers, a symbolic gesture of dismissal, and reached for the radio on his shoulder. He was done playing games. He was going to bring the full weight of the department into his personal crusade. With his back to Imani and the growing crowd of witnesses, Officer Miller pressed the button on his shoulder-mounted radio. The burst of static that followed was a prelude to the lie he was about to codify, to make official. He had painted himself into a corner, and now, instead of finding a way out, he decided to build the walls higher. His voice, when he spoke, was a strained, artificial version of police jargon, designed to sound professional and urgent to anyone listening on the frequency. "Dispatch, this is 3 Adam 12, he began, his tone clipped. "I have a vehicle stopped at the corner of Oak and Elm. Driver is non-compliant. I need a secondary unit for backup." The words hung in the air, a grotesque distortion of reality. Non-compliant. The term was a weapon, a catch-all justification used to transform a citizen asserting their rights into a potential threat. Imani, sitting perfectly still and cooperative in her car, was the very definition of compliant. She had followed every instruction, save for admitting to a crime she didn't commit. Miller's use of the word was a calculated falsehood, an attempt to retroactively justify his aggression. He was creating a paper trail, an official record that would, he hoped, shield him from the consequences of his actions. He was no longer just a rogue officer on a power trip. He was now actively fabricating a report in real time. In the car, Imani heard his transmission through her open window. A cold, hard knot formed in her stomach. This was the most dangerous moment yet. The radio call was an irreversible step. It meant he was doubling down, committing to his narrative. It also meant another officer was on the way, an unknown variable who would likely arrive assuming the situation was exactly as Miller had described, a hostile, uncooperative suspect. She knew that the dynamic would change dramatically with the arrival of a second officer. The odds would shift. The potential for a violent misunderstanding would skyrocket. The dispatcher's voice crackled back, calm and routine. "Copy 3 Adam 12. A secondary unit is en route. ETA 5 minutes. 5 minutes. To Imani, it felt like both a lifetime and no time at all. She had 5 minutes before this situation escalated beyond Miller's singular control. Her mind raced, processing tactical options. Should she announce her own status now? No, that could be misinterpreted as a threat, especially with Miller this agitated. He might think she was lying, a desperate attempt to avoid arrest. It was better to wait, to let the events play out, to allow him to dig his own hole as deep as possible. Every lie he told, every procedure he broke, was another piece of evidence. Her training emphasized evidence collection, and in a way, that's exactly what she was doing now, letting the subject of her unofficial investigation provide all the proof she would ever need. Miller turned back toward her car, a new, smug look on his face. The radio call had emboldened him. He was no longer alone in this. The system was now involved, a system he felt confident would take his side. "Backup's on the way," he announced, as if it were a threat. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way. It's up to you." The only hard way here, officer, is the one you seem determined to create, Imani replied, her voice still a low, steady anchor in the swirling chaos of his making. I have complied with all lawful orders. You have refused to identify yourself or to process my valid identification. She was still building her record, speaking to the silent witnesses, to the recording phones, and to the body camera she assumed he was wearing. Every word was a brick in the wall of facts she was constructing around his fiction. He scoffed and turned away again, pacing near the curb, the image of a patient officer dealing with a difficult subject. But the witnesses saw the truth. They had seen her calm demeanor, her offered documents. They had heard his shouting. They knew who the difficult one was. The sound of a distant siren began to cut through the air, growing steadily closer. The clock was ticking. The siren grew from a faint cry to a piercing wail, culminating in a sharp chirp as a second patrol car swung around the corner with unnecessary speed, its tires crunching on the gravel shoulder as it pulled up behind Miller's vehicle. The door flew open and Officer Russo stepped out, a younger cop in his late 20s with a reputation for being Miller's shadow. Where Miller led, Russo followed, eager to earn the approval of the senior officer he idolized. He was shorter and stockier than Miller, with a face that seemed permanently set in a belligerent scowl. He didn't approach the scene with the caution of an officer entering an unknown situation. He approached it with the swagger of a man who already knew whose side he was on. He strode past Imani's car without even a glance in her direction, his focus entirely on Miller.
"What's the situation, Derek?"
he asked, his voice loud enough for Imani to hear clearly. "Got a real piece of work here," Miller said, gesturing dismissively toward Imani's car. "Stopped her for a clear-moving violation and she's been giving me nothing but attitude. Refusing to cooperate. Claims the car's hers, but I'm not buying it." He delivered the summary in a low, conspiratorial tone, a quick download of his fabricated reality. Russo nodded, his expression hardening. He accepted Miller's version of events without question. He didn't ask what the violation was. He didn't ask what Imani had said or done. He didn't even bother to observe her calm, non-threatening posture in the driver's seat. He simply absorbed Miller's bias and made it his own. The two of them now formed a united front, a wall of blue solidarity built on a foundation of lies. Russo turned and walked toward Imani's window, positioning himself a few feet behind where Miller had stood, creating a classic two-on-one tactical disadvantage for her. She was now flanked, the feeling of being caged and watched intensifying. Russo peered into her car, his eyes, like Miller's, scanning for any sign of trouble, any justification for their escalating actions. "Ma'am," Russo began, his tone a poor imitation of official courtesy, "my partner says you're being uncooperative. You need to understand that resisting an officer is a serious offense. Just give him what he asked for and we can all move on." The irony was staggering. Imani was the one attempting to cooperate, and they were the ones resisting the legal process. "I have already offered your partner my license and registration multiple times," she stated clearly, turning her head slightly so both officers could hear her. "He has refused to take them. He has not identified the specific statute I allegedly violated, and he is now detaining me without cause. I am not the one being uncooperative here." Her calm, articulate response seemed to short-circuit Russo's brain. He glanced at Miller, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He had arrived expecting a screaming, belligerent suspect. Instead, he found a woman who spoke like a lawyer and showed no fear. Miller, sensing his partner's hesitation, stepped forward to regain control. "See what I mean?" Miller said to Russo, his voice dripping with condescension. "She's a sea lawyer. Thinks she can talk her way out of anything." He then turned his full attention back to Imani, his face a mask of contempt. "We're done talking. Step out of the vehicle, now!" It was a direct order, and a completely unlawful one. An officer cannot order a driver out of a vehicle during a routine traffic stop without a reasonable suspicion of a crime or a threat to officer safety. They had neither. The order was a pure power play, an attempt to physically dominate the situation where verbal intimidation had failed. The arrival of Russo hadn't brought a voice of reason, it had simply amplified the aggression, doubling the threat and pushing the encounter one step closer to its inevitable disastrous conclusion. The unlawful order to exit the vehicle hung in the air, a stark escalation. Imani's mind, a finely tuned instrument of legal and tactical knowledge, processed the command instantly. She knew her rights down to the specific case law that governed traffic stops. This was the moment the encounter tipped from unprofessional to unconstitutional. She had to respond, not with emotion, but with the cold, hard weight of the law itself. "Officer," she began, her voice remaining perfectly level, a stark contrast to the simmering rage emanating from the two men outside her window. "Under Pennsylvania v. Mims, I understand an officer can order a driver out of a legally stopped vehicle for safety. However, this stop is not predicated on a lawful violation. You have failed to articulate reasonable suspicion of any crime. Therefore, your order for me to exit my vehicle is unlawful. I am staying in my car." Her citation of case law was like a foreign language to them. Miller's face contorted with a mixture of confusion and fury. He had likely never had a civilian quote Supreme Court precedent to him during a stop. He didn't hear the legal reasoning, he only heard defiance. Russo, standing behind him, just looked bewildered, his confidence visibly shaken by a response so far outside his experience. "What did you just say?" Miller sputtered, leaning down again, his face inches from the window. "Are you a lawyer or something? You think quoting some fancy words is going to get you out of this?" "I am a citizen who knows her rights," Imani replied, her gaze unwavering. "And you are currently violating them. Specifically, my Fourth Amendment right against unreasonable searches and seizures. This detention is unreasonable because it lacks probable cause." Each word was a precise surgical strike. She wasn't arguing, she was educating. She was laying down a verbal foundation for the legal battle she knew was coming. Her composure was her armor, and the law was her sword. To the officers, however, it was the ultimate act of insubordination. They operated in a world of simple commands and expected obedience. Nuance, rights, and legal precedent were inconvenient obstacles to their desired outcome. Miller straightened up and laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. He turned to Russo. "Can you believe this? She thinks she's in a courtroom." He looked back at Imani, his eyes burning with a renewed, dangerous intensity. "This is the street, lady, not a classroom. And out here, my word is the law. I gave you a lawful order. You are now obstructing a police investigation. I'm going to give you one final chance. Step out of the car." He punctuated each word with a sharp, angry jab of his finger. The threat was clear. He was now inventing a new crime, obstruction, to justify his illegal commands. It was a classic, desperate tactic of an officer who has lost control and is trying to regain it through sheer force of will. Imani took a slow, deliberate breath. She had made her stand. She had clearly articulated the illegality of his actions. There was nothing more to be said that would penetrate the wall of his arrogance. She had to make a choice. Continue to resist an unlawful order from within the relative safety of her car, or comply to avoid a potentially violent physical extraction. Her training screamed at her to de-escalate and survive the encounter. The fight wasn't here on the street, it was later in the courts. "I am not obstructing," she said, her voice now tinged with a solemn finality. "But I will not give you a reason to harm me. I will exit the vehicle." She put her hands up slowly, palms open and facing him, to show she had no weapons and intended no threat. "I am complying under duress, and I want it noted that this entire interaction is being performed against my will and in violation of my constitutional rights." She unlocked the door. The quiet click echoed in the tense silence, a sound of capitulation that was, in reality, the beginning of his end. With a slow, deliberate motion, Imani pushed the car door open. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke to years of physical training, every action controlled and non-threatening. She swung her legs out and stood up, her eyes never leaving Officer Miller. She stood tall, her posture radiating a quiet dignity that seemed to infuriate him even further. She had complied with his order, but she had not been broken by it. She had surrendered the tactical position, but not her resolve. Miller, seeing her finally outside the car, felt a surge of triumphant power. He had won this battle of wills. He immediately moved to assert his dominance physically. "Turn around," he commanded, his voice a low growl. "Hands behind your back." "On what grounds am I being arrested?" Imani asked, her voice steady even as his shadow loomed over her. She did not turn. "You're not being arrested. You're being detained for officer safety while I conduct my investigation," Miller lied, the words flowing easily. It was a nonsensical justification. Detaining someone in handcuffs is, for all intents and purposes, a temporary arrest, and it requires reasonable suspicion that the person is armed and dangerous. Imani, in her business attire and with her calm demeanor, met none of those criteria. Russo, now fully back in his role as Miller's enforcer, stepped forward to flank her on the other side. "Just do what he says, ma'am." "It will be easier for everyone," he said, his hand already on his own handcuffs. Imani held her ground for a final second, her mind cataloging every violation. The unlawful stop, the baseless detention, the illegal order to exit the vehicle, and now an unjustified physical seizure. The chain of evidence was complete. She had given them every opportunity to de-escalate, to follow the law. They had refused at every turn. Slowly, she turned and placed her hands behind her back. She wasn't surrendering to them. She was surrendering to the strategic necessity of the moment. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into her wrists. Miller cinched them down with a sharp, unnecessary tug, a petty display of physical power. The definitive click, click, click of the ratchet echoed in the quiet street. It was a sound of finality, the sound of a line being crossed from which there was no return. For Imani, it was a moment of profound vulnerability, a feeling she had not experienced in years. Despite her extensive training and formidable skills, here on this street, she was at the mercy of two men armed with ignorance and impunity. She felt a flicker of anger, hot and sharp, but she suppressed it instantly. Emotion was a liability she could not afford. Miller placed a firm hand on her shoulder and pushed her toward the hood of her own car. "Stay right there," he ordered. "Don't move." He then turned to Russo with a triumphant smirk. "See? A little persuasion is all it takes." He felt vindicated. The woman who had challenged him with her words and her composure was now in his physical control, cuffed and compliant. In his mind, the natural order had been restored. The witnesses on the sidewalk gasped. A few of them raised their phones more openly now, their earlier discretion replaced by a sense of shock and outrage. The scene had transformed from a tense argument into a clear case of police overreach. They were no longer just watching, they were documenting an injustice. Miller, high on his sense of victory, ignored them. He was already thinking about his next step, searching the car. He believed that once he got inside, he would find something, anything, to justify his actions. He had to, because if that car was clean, he knew, in a small, terrified corner of his mind, that he was in very deep trouble. While Officer Miller savored his hollow victory on the street, a silent, impartial network of observers was meticulously documenting his every move. These witnesses weren't human. They couldn't be intimidated by a glare or an order to move along. They were the unblinking eyes of technology, and they were capturing a truth far more damning than any single bystander's testimony could provide. The first and most crucial eye was Miller's own body camera. Per department policy, it had been recording since the moment he activated his cruiser's lights. The small black device mounted on his chest was a Trojan horse. He saw it as a tool to protect himself, to record a suspect's non-compliance. He was blind to the fact that it was actually his own conduct under scrutiny. The camera recorded his aggressive approach, his sneering tone, his refusal to take Imani's ID. It captured his fabricated claim of a lane change violation and his pivot to overt profiling. Most damningly, It recorded Imani's calm, legally precise responses, a perfect audio record of her attempts to de-escalate and assert her rights lawfully. Every word of his escalating threats, every unlawful command, was being saved to a hard drive that would soon become Exhibit A. The second eye belonged to Officer Russo. His camera had activated automatically as well, offering a different but equally damning perspective. It captured Miller's conspiratorial summary of the situation, a clear audio recording of him lying to a fellow officer. It showed Russo's immediate acceptance of the lie and his mirroring of Miller's aggressive posture. It provided a side angle of the cuffing, showing Imani's non-resistance and the unnecessary force Miller used to tighten the restraints. Together, the two cameras created a 3D reconstruction of the event, leaving no room for ambiguity or dispute. A third set of eyes watched from across the street. A high-definition security camera mounted on the corner of the coffee shop had a wide, clear view of the entire scene. Its footage was silent, but visually comprehensive. It showed the flawless, legal turn Imani made. It showed Miller following her for several blocks without cause. It showed the entire stop, from Miller's initial approach to the arrival of Russo to the moment Imani was placed in handcuffs. The camera's timestamp would later serve as an objective clock, corroborating the timeline and exposing the lack of any precipitating event that could justify Miller's actions. It saw what the witnesses saw, but with perfect clarity and without the fallibility of human memory. And there was one more. The dash cam in a parked delivery truck just a few yards ahead of Imani's car. The driver, on a break, had been watching the scene unfold and had left his system running. This camera provided a ground-level, forward-facing view, capturing the expressions on the officers' faces as they confronted Imani. It caught the contempt in Miller's eyes and the uncertainty in Russo's. It recorded the looks of shock and dismay on the faces of the passers-by. This collection of digital evidence was weaving a tight, inescapable net. Miller and Russo were operating under the delusion that it was their word against hers, that the blue wall of silence and the inherent authority of their uniforms would protect them. They failed to grasp the fundamental shift in modern policing. Every action is potentially being recorded. The street was no longer a private stage for their power plays. It was a television studio, and the show they were producing was a real-time documentary of their own downfall. Every frame of video, every byte of data was a silent testament to their misconduct, waiting patiently to be presented to a world that would not be so quick to take their word for it. With Imani secured and his ego restored, Miller turned his attention to the prize, the car. "All right, Russo, let's see what she's hiding," he said with a greedy glint in his eye. "You take the driver's side, I'll take the passenger's." He was about to compound his illegal detention with an illegal search, a cascade of constitutional violations born from a single prejudiced decision. Russo nodded and moved toward the driver's door, his hand ready to pull the handle. But just as his fingers made contact with the cool metal, a new sound cut through the air. It wasn't a siren. It was the assertive, authoritative chirp of a different kind of police horn, followed by the sight of a black, unmarked sedan pulling up sharply behind Russo's cruiser. The vehicle had none of the standard markings of a patrol car, but it radiated an unmistakable aura of command. The driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was in her late 40s, wearing a crisp, practical uniform with sergeant stripes on the sleeves. Her name was Sergeant Eva Rostova, and she was the patrol supervisor for the district. Rostova was known throughout the department as a sharp, no-nonsense veteran who had seen everything and tolerated nothing. She ran her shift with an iron fist and had a reputation for holding her officers to the highest standards, particularly when it came to procedure. Her arrival was completely unexpected. Miller hadn't called for a supervisor. In fact, a supervisor was the last person he wanted to see right now. Sergeant Rostova didn't rush. She walked toward the scene with a measured, observant pace, her eyes taking in every detail with practiced efficiency. She saw the two patrol cars, the expensive sedan parked at the curb, the small crowd of onlookers with their phones held aloft, her two officers poised to search the vehicle, and most alarmingly, a well-dressed black woman in handcuffs, standing perfectly still by the hood of her car. Rostova's face, already stern, hardened into a mask of deep concern. The scene didn't look like a standard police action. It looked like a mess. It reeked of a complaint waiting to happen. "Miller! Russo!" Her voice wasn't a shout, but it cut through the air with such authority that both men froze instantly, turning to face her. Russo snatched his hand back from the car door as if it were red hot. Miller's confident smirk evaporated, replaced by a flicker of panic. "Sergeant," Miller stammered, caught completely off guard. We've got a situation here." "I can see that," Rostova said, her voice dangerously calm as she came to a stop a few feet away. She didn't look at Miller. Her eyes were on Imani, assessing her composure, her attire, the incongruity of her being in handcuffs. "What I want to know is why this situation involves two of my officers, a crowd of witnesses, and a woman in cuffs over what looks like a simple traffic stop." Her gaze shifted to Miller, and it was cold and penetrating. "Talk to me, Miller. Start from the beginning, and it had better be good." The sudden shift in power was seismic. Miller was no longer the king of this small roadside kingdom. His authority had been instantly usurped. He was no longer the accuser. He was the accused, standing before his judge. The confident predator of a few minutes ago was now a stammering subordinate, scrambling to construct a version of events that wouldn't immediately unravel under the supervisor who prized facts above all else. The air crackled with a new tension, but this time, Miller wasn't the one creating it. He was the one trapped in it. Trapped under Sergeant Rostova's icy gaze, Derek Miller began to speak, his voice losing its earlier boom and taking on a defensive, almost whiny tone. "I pulled her over for an illegal lane change back at Oak, Sergeant. She was immediately belligerent, refused to provide her ID, started spouting a bunch of legal nonsense at me. I began to suspect the car might be stolen, and she was acting suspicious. That's when I called for backup and detained her for officer safety." It was a condensed version of his fantasy, a string of half-truths and outright lies woven together in a desperate attempt to sound credible. Rostova listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. She had heard 1,000 stories like this from 1,000 cops. She knew how to filter the self-serving jargon from the truth. She turned her attention away from the fumbling Miller and walked directly toward Imani. She stopped a respectful distance away and looked her directly in the eye. "Ma'am, I am Sergeant Rostova," she said, her voice firm but professional, a stark contrast to the conduct of her subordinates. "I understand you've been asked for your identification. May I see it, please?" This was the moment Imani had been waiting for. The arrival of a competent officer, a third party who operated within the bounds of policy and reason. She met the sergeant's gaze. "Of course, Sergeant," she said, her voice still steady. "My wallet is in my purse on the passenger seat. However, I also have my primary credentials in the left inner pocket of my blazer." She paused, letting the weight of her next words settle. "I am Special Agent Imani Knight, Federal Service. I was on my way to a classified briefing when your officer initiated this baseless stop." The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if a soundproof barrier had dropped over the scene. The distant traffic, the rustling leaves, the murmuring crowd, it all faded away. The only sound was the frantic pounding in Miller's and Russo's chests. Special Agent. The words detonated in the space between them. Russo's jaw went slack, his eyes wide with dawning horror. Miller's face, which had been flushed with anger, went completely pale. The color drained from it as if a plug had been pulled. He stared at Imani, not as a suspect anymore, but as a ghost from a future he had just destroyed. He saw his career, his pension, his entire life flashing before his eyes. A federal agent. They hadn't just harassed a civilian, they had unlawfully detained a federal officer in the course of her duties. Sergeant Rostova's professional mask finally cracked. A flash of pure, unadulterated fury crossed her face before she brought it back under control. She looked at Imani's blazer. "Agent Knight, With your permission, I'm going to retrieve your credentials myself. Permission granted, Sergeant, Imani replied. Rostova stepped forward, her movements precise. She carefully reached into Imani's blazer, her fingers finding the thin, leather-bound credential case. She flipped it open. The golden shield and the crisp photo ID gleamed in the sunlight. It was real. It was all real. Rostova snapped the case shut. She turned her head slowly, her eyes locking onto Miller with an intensity that made him physically recoil. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her whisper was more terrifying than any shout. "Miller," she said, her voice a low, venomous hiss. "What have you done?" The question was rhetorical. They all knew what he had done. He had taken a quiet morning and, out of pure, unadulterated prejudice, turned it into a career-ending, department-suing, multi-million-dollar catastrophe. The shield of a federal agent had just shattered the sword of his petty tyranny. The aftermath of the revelation was a study in contrasts. Agent Knight remained still and composed, a pillar of stoicism amidst the wreckage she had just unveiled. Sergeant Rostova, on the other hand, moved with the explosive energy of a detonated bomb. She whirled on Miller and Rousseau, her face a thundercloud of absolute fury. "Get these cuffs off her! Now!" she roared, her voice finally breaking its controlled restraint. The command cracked through the air like a whip. Miller and Rousseau jumped as if they'd been tasered. They fumbled for their cuff keys, their hands shaking so badly they could barely perform the simple task. Miller, the man who had so smugly applied the restraints, was now a portrait of pathetic incompetence. His fingers trembled as he tried to insert the key into the lock. He dropped it once, the tiny piece of metal clattering on the pavement with a sound that seemed to echo his shattering confidence. He snatched it up, his face slick with a sudden cold sweat. Rousseau, looking utterly lost, managed to unlock his side first. The cuff sprang open. Miller finally got his own key to work, and the second restraint fell away. The heavy steel bracelets were gone. Imani slowly brought her hands around to her front, rubbing her wrists where the metal had chafed her skin. The red marks were a visible testament to the indignity she had just endured. "I am so sorry, Agent Knight," Rostova said, her voice thick with a mixture of professional apology and personal mortification. "This never should have happened. My officer's conduct was inexcusable." "Thank you, Sergeant," Imani replied coolly. "I agree." She didn't offer forgiveness. She didn't say, "It's okay." She simply accepted the apology as a statement of fact, which, in its own way, was more chilling. Miller, meanwhile, was imploding. The arrogant bully of moments before had vanished, replaced by a pale, trembling man who couldn't seem to form a coherent sentence. "Sergeant, I didn't know," he stammered, his eyes darting between Rostova and Knight. "She never said... I thought she was..." "You thought she was what, Miller?" Rostova cut him off, her voice dripping with contempt. "A black woman who couldn't possibly own a nice car? Is that what you thought? Did you run her plates? Did you even look at the ID she told me she offered you?" Miller's mouth opened and closed like a fish, but no sound came out. He knew the answer to both questions was no. He had acted on pure, unfiltered bias, and now the consequences were crashing down on him with the force of a tidal wave. He looked at Rousseau for support, but his partner refused to meet his gaze, staring instead at the toes of his own boots as if they held the secrets of the universe. The alliance was broken. It was every man for himself. "Both of you," Rostova commanded, pointing a rigid finger toward their patrol cars. "Radio that you're clear from this call, then turn off your body cameras. You will then drive back to the precinct. You will go straight to my office. You will sit down, and you will not speak to anyone until I get there. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Sergeant," they mumbled in unison, their voices barely audible. They looked like scolded schoolboys, stripped of all their authority and bravado. They shuffled back toward their cars, their movements clumsy and defeated. The witnesses on the sidewalk watched the entire exchange, their expressions shifting from concern to a kind of grim satisfaction. They had just seen power checked, arrogance humbled, and justice, in its initial form, served right before their eyes. The balance had not just shifted, it had been completely and irrevocably overturned. As Miller and Russo retreated in disgrace, Sergeant Rostova turned her full attention back to Agent Knight. "Agent, is there anything you need? A bottle of water? Do you want to file an initial complaint right here? I will take your statement personally." She was in full damage control mode, but there was a genuine professional respect in her tone. She was speaking to a peer, an equal in the world of law enforcement, whose jurisdiction and authority far outstripped her own. Imani took a moment, glancing at her car, then at the street, and finally back at the sergeant. "Thank you, Sergeant Rostova, but that won't be necessary right now," she said, her voice calm and measured. "My priority is to get to my briefing. This incident has already made me late." Her ability to compartmentalize, to shift back to her primary mission even after such a flagrant violation of her rights, was a testament to her discipline. Rostova nodded, understanding completely. "Of course, Agent. I will personally escort you to ensure you have no further delays." "That's a kind offer, but I'll be fine," Imani replied. She didn't want an escort. She didn't want any more of this department's presence around her than was absolutely necessary. She walked to her car door and opened it, the motion fluid and unhurried. Before getting in, she paused and turned, her gaze sweeping past Rostova to land directly on Derek Miller, who was standing frozen by his cruiser, watching her with a look of pure dread. Their eyes met across the 10 yards of pavement that separated them. The street noise, the sergeant, the other witnesses, everything faded away for that one intense moment. Imani's face was unreadable, a mask of professional neutrality, but her eyes held a message, a promise delivered with more power than any shouted threat. "Officer Miller," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the now quiet space. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, precise, and absolutely unforgettable.
Everything that happened here today,
Every word you said, every action you took, every right you violated has been noted. It has been recorded, and it will be addressed. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't curse or threaten. She simply stated a fact, a procedural certainty. It was the calm, dispassionate promise of consequences delivered by someone who intimately understood the system and how to make it work. It was the verbal equivalent of a signed and sealed indictment. For Miller, it was the sound of a guillotine blade sliding into place. It was the confirmation that this wasn't over. This was just the beginning of the end. Imani held his gaze for another second before turning away, sliding into the driver's seat, and closing the door with a soft, definitive click. The engine purred to life, a low hum of power that seemed to mock the two disgraced officers. She pulled away from the curb smoothly, signaled, and merged back into traffic, disappearing down the street as if the last 20 minutes had never happened. She was gone, but her final words lingered in the air, an invisible indictment hanging over Miller's head. Sergeant Rostova watched the gray sedan disappear, then turned to her officers one last time, her face set like stone. "Get in your cars," she ordered, her voice flat and devoid of any remaining sympathy. "Your careers as you know them are over." Miller finally broke, slumping against his cruiser, the full weight of his actions crushing him at last. The moment Imani Knight's car disappeared from view, the institutional gears of justice, both internal and external, began to grind into motion. Before Sergeant Rostova had even finished her preliminary report back at the precinct, the digital evidence from the scene was already being compiled. The body camera footage from Miller and Russo was flagged and uploaded to a secure server under an internal affairs hold. The high-definition video from the coffee shop security camera was requested and obtained within the hour. Even the delivery truck driver, realizing the significance of what he'd recorded, called the department's non-emergency line to report his dashcam footage. The net of accountability was now woven from gigabytes of irrefutable, time-stamped proof. Internal affairs investigators watched the footage in a small, dark room, the glow of the monitors illuminating their grim faces. They saw everything. They saw Miller's predatory prowling before the stop. They saw Imani's perfect legal turn. They heard Miller's fabricated accusation and his refusal to look at her ID. They saw his unprofessional rage, his biased questioning, and his lies to his backup officer. They saw a textbook case of racial profiling escalating into an unconstitutional seizure. There were no gray areas, no room for interpretation. The footage was a prosecutor's dream. By the next morning, the story had leaked. A witness with a particularly clear cell phone video sold it to a local news station. The clip went viral. Within hours, Agent Knight and Officer Miller were trending on social media. The video, raw and infuriating, played on a loop on cable news. Pundits and legal analysts dissected every second, universally condemning Miller's and Russo's conduct and praising Knight's incredible restraint. Public outrage was swift and massive. The police department's phone lines were flooded with angry calls. The mayor's office issued a statement promising a full and transparent investigation. Meanwhile, Imani Knight, with the full backing of her federal agency, contacted a top civil rights law firm. Her case was not just about personal grievance, it was about institutional failure. The lawsuit they prepared was a masterpiece of legal precision. It was filed against Officer Derek Miller, Officer Russo, and the city itself, citing a pattern of negligence in training and supervision. The complaint detailed every violation: racial profiling, illegal search and seizure, false imprisonment, abuse of authority, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. It used the officers' own body camera footage as the primary evidence, quoting their words, describing their actions frame by frame. And then there was the demand for damages. It wasn't a symbolic number. It was a calculated figure designed to punish the city for its failures and to compensate an elite federal officer for the profound violations she had endured. The number was $18 million. $18 million. The headline was explosive. News outlets ran it in bold, declarative type. 18 million lawsuit filed by federal agent after horrific traffic stop. The city's lawyers read the complaint and knew, almost instantly, that they had no defense. The evidence was too perfect, too complete. Going to trial would be a public relations bloodbath that they were guaranteed to lose. A jury would see the same videos the public was already seeing, and their anger would be reflected in a verdict that could potentially be even higher. The digital reckoning was complete. The quiet, unblinking eyes of the cameras had done their job. They had captured the truth, and that truth had been weaponized into a legal and financial bombshell that now threatened to bankrupt the city's insurance fund and force a top-to-bottom reform of its police department. Miller's 20-minute power trip on a quiet suburban street was about to cost the taxpayers millions. The fallout was as swift as it was brutal. Facing an unwinnable court battle and crippling public pressure, the city's attorneys moved quickly to settle. There were no lengthy negotiations. The evidence was so overwhelmingly against them that their only option was to staunch the bleeding. The city council approved the $18 million settlement in a closed-door emergency session, one of the largest in the city's history. The payment was an admission of guilt, a public acknowledgement of the profound injustice Agent Imani Knight had suffered. For Derek Miller and his partner Russo, the end came just as quickly. The internal affairs investigation concluded in record time. Presented with the mountain of video evidence, their police union representatives could offer only a token defense before advising them to resign. They were officially terminated for gross misconduct, violations of departmental policy, and conduct unbecoming of an officer. Their badges were taken, their careers were over, and they were left as disgraced pariahs in the law enforcement community. Miller, the arrogant predator who had sought to reassert his dominance, was now unemployed and facing potential civil litigation that could follow him for the rest of his life. In the wake of the settlement, the police department was forced into a period of painful but necessary reform. Under the threat of a federal investigation by the Department of Justice, the chief implemented a sweeping new set of protocols. Anti-bias and de-escalation training, once a brief yearly seminar, became a rigorous, ongoing program. The rules governing traffic stops were tightened, and a new duty to intervene policy was enacted, legally requiring officers like Russo to step in and stop misconduct by their partners rather than enabling it. The Amani Knight case became a mandatory training video, a stark, real-world example of how prejudice and arrogance could lead to personal and institutional ruin. The quiet traffic stop became a catalyst for change, its ripples spreading through the entire department. Agent Knight herself accepted the settlement with the same quiet dignity she had displayed throughout the entire ordeal. She returned to her duties, her reputation among her colleagues only enhanced. She was seen as a symbol of grace under fire, a professional who had faced down raw, ignorant prejudice and had emerged not just victorious, but as an agent of systemic reform. The money was secondary. The true victory was in the accountability that had been forced upon a broken system. As the headlines fade and the outrage subsides, what remains is the quiet echo of that morning, a moment suspended in time by the unblinking eyes of cameras. One must ask what internal poison drove a man like Derek Miller. His actions were not born from a single bad day, but from a deep-seated well of resentment. Perhaps he saw in Agent Knight everything he felt he was not: composed, successful, and respected in a world he no longer understood. His badge was not a tool for justice, but a shield for his own insecurities. He saw a black woman in a nice car not as a fellow citizen, but as a challenge to his fragile sense of order, a world where people didn't stay in the places he had assigned them. If only he had possessed a fraction of the self-awareness to recognize his own bias, he might have simply driven on, and his life would have remained intact. His prejudice was a loaded gun he had been carrying for years, and on that day, he finally pointed it at a target and pulled the trigger, destroying himself in the process. And what of Agent Knight? Could she have done anything differently to avoid the confrontation? Perhaps if she had immediately declared her federal status the second he approached her window, the encounter might have ended before it began. But that path, while safer for her personally, would have left the poison in the system. Miller would have been momentarily thwarted, but he would have driven away unchecked, free to terrorize another citizen who didn't have a badge to hide behind. By choosing to endure, by choosing to be the calm, professional citizen and let his venomous prejudice expose itself fully, she performed a greater service. She didn't just save herself from a ticket, she forced a reckoning that would, hopefully, save countless others from the same fate. Her courage was not in resisting him with force, but in resisting him with composure, creating the perfect evidence of his failure. The story of Agent Knight and Officer Miller is a stark reminder that accountability is not given, it is demanded. It is a lesson that in the modern age, the most powerful weapon against injustice is often the silent, objective truth captured on camera. It reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it, and that true strength lies not in the authority of a uniform, but in the integrity of one's character. What do you think is the most effective way to combat this kind of deep-seated bias in law enforcement? Have you ever witnessed a situation where someone's calm composure completely de-armed an aggressor? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and please subscribe for more stories where justice prevails.